Thanks for that lovely introduction. So, as Mark said, I am a scientist, which is why we have the periodic table here in case you need to reference it during the talk. I'm very excited to be here. It's great to see an audience of people who, if your reputation is accurate, are open to ideas that are uncomfortable. That is increasingly rare, and I admire you all for participating in that here rather than shunning ideas that make you uncomfortable. So I did think there was going to be an hour and a half, and I put together a talk that would take about an hour, leaving a half hour for questions, and it turns out that the room is actually booked immediately following this talk, so there probably won't be as much room as I would like. That may result in it sounding as if I'm speaking in riddles. I apologize for that. So first, a bit of fair warning. Evergreen became famous as a result of the controversy that turned my life upside down. But the way in which it became famous actually gave a very wrong impression of what the place is like. In many ways, Evergreen ended up looking absurd. And that was not my experience of Evergreen for the 14 years that I taught there. The thing about Evergreen is that it provides unparalleled academic freedom to its faculty members, and that manifests in the classroom. Evergreen professors are literally not obligated to teach any particular subject. So long as students show up, you are free to teach in the manner you want, any subject that you wish. And that results in a couple of things. It does mean that people who wish to reduce their workload can do it, or people who do stuff at the far fringes might do that as well. But it also means that for those of us who are really interested in pushing the bounds of pedagogy, it is a blank canvas and a marvelous opportunity that I already miss greatly. So here you have a picture of a class of students that my wife and I had for a full year together in a program that traveled to Ecuador for 11 weeks. We went deep into the Amazon. We went to the Galapagos. We went to many different locations. Here you see a student group at a women's hat-making cooperative in Ecuador. But in any case, the point, as it is relevant to you all, is that the material that I'm going to cover tonight is something that would happen at the end of 6 months of investment. In an Evergreen program is full-time for faculty, it's full-time for students. So at the point that this material would show up, people would have had 6 months of preparation in a full-time intensive program. You guys are going to encounter it over the course of an hour, and that's going to make it challenging, but we will do our best. So the first thing we have to talk about is human nature. Human nature is a very difficult topic until you figure out where to stand in order to understand it. Part of the problem with human nature is that there is no human nature per se. If you think about all of the things that human beings have been known to do over the millennia, you will recognize that human beings can do a great many things, from hunting marine mammals to farming the sea to intensive agriculture. And so all of those things suggest that there's something about human beings that is very odd for a creature. For a creature to do that many different things simultaneously pushes our understanding of the idea of creature. But before human beings are something very special, they are creatures that are built around the same purpose that other creatures are built. And it is a little hard to specify exactly what that purpose is, but I have found it very useful to think in terms of what I call pie chart logic. Human beings, like other creatures, are interested in discovering opportunities that are either unexploited or exploited by some entity that is not capable of defending that resource. So when creatures discover such an opportunity, they experience a burst of non-zero-sum dynamics. So zero-sum dynamics are dynamics where in order for one individual to win, somebody else has to lose. When one discovers a new opportunity, nobody has to lose in order for others to win. And so there is a quest ongoing for all evolved creatures to discover non-zero-sum opportunities because they create an increase in evolutionary well-being. Now, the chart on the screen will allow you to understand that there are various kinds of ways to experience a burst of non-zero-sum growth. And you can increase the size of the slice of pie that your population has available to it, or you can push the sides of the pie into somebody else's territory. Anything that results in an increase in the size of the slice of pie that a particular population has available to it is a temporary, non-zero-sum circumstance, which is highly desirable. So this has resulted, evolutionarily, in an addiction to growth. That is to say, creatures discover these opportunities, they exploit them, and they are constantly in a quest to find new ones. Growth is effectively what winning feels like in evolutionary terms, right? So we call it growth in economic terms, but really it is the same property that other creatures experience when they find a new location or a new mechanism for doing things that is superior to the old one. Now, the important part from the perspective of understanding human beings is to realize that human beings have been through, every single population that exists today has been through a series of oscillations, discovering new non-zero-sum opportunities, exploiting them, filling them up, and at the point that they have become full, they become zero-sum dynamics again. That means that we have to have within us programs, effectively, that deal with both phases. Now, it is my argument that when we have non-zero-sum dynamics, when we have one of these bursts of growth, people are capable of being wonderful to each other, and they often do that. And then when those non-zero-sum opportunities are spent, people go into a different phase. And part of what creates trouble for humanity is that if we live in an abundant phase, we tend to expect that that is human nature. And when the dynamics set in that do not have that benevolence built into them, we tend to think something has gone awry, and we seek to reinstate that former burst of growth. Now, ecologists have a couple of terms that are useful in terms of thinking about this. It is not that when we find a non-zero-sum opportunity, there is no competition. That is a misunderstanding of the biology of the circumstance. When we find a new opportunity, there is a kind of competition, but it is not head-to-head competition. It is what ecologists would call exploitation competition, where you compete by capturing that resource, but you don't necessarily interfere with other individuals trying to do the same thing. The alternative is interference competition, where the mechanism for competing actually involves disrupting the other individuals trying to capture the same resource. So my contention is that non-zero-sum dynamics do not result in an absence of competition, but they result in a kind of competition that is in general much more desirable. Having found a non-zero-sum opportunity, creatures tend to produce more creatures like themselves, which results in the exhaustion of that opportunity. So creatures are programmed, therefore, to find these opportunities and to capture them and squirrel them away in whatever mechanism is available. So that can be in the form of more mouths. If you think about individuals that find themselves in an abundant new landscape, they can produce a great many more individuals like themselves than they would under standard carrying capacity conditions. In human beings, there's another possibility too, which has to do with consumption. So human beings can capture an opportunity and defend it by bringing it into production of some kind. And human beings do both things. The result of this for people has been the creation of what I call a throughput society. So if you think about what you know from economics, you will realize that we actually literally define economic growth as a state in which we are maximizing the rate at which we are converting useful energy into useless heat and converting precious resources into trash. If I invent a refrigerator that's just as efficient as the one you have and it lasts 10 times as long, that should be a good thing, right? Intuitively, it makes sense that I'm making the world better by producing that refrigerator. But you'll note that it results in a whole lot fewer refrigerators being sold, and that will register in economic models as a failure of growth. And we will wonder what we are doing wrong, that the growth that used to accompany the repeated sale of refrigerators to the same people has stopped. So this throughput society is extremely dangerous in the sense that we now have the tools to jeopardize ourselves because we are wired evolutionarily to find these resources, to capture them, and then to effectively turn them into unrecoverable states. The way to think about human dynamics, I find, is to think about frontiers. Now, I should warn you, frontier is a term that has some unpleasant connotations. And unfortunately, there's no term that competes with it in terms of meaning. So what I would like you to do is, for the moment, put aside the unpleasant connotations that come along with the term frontier and just take it as a scientific concept for the moment. And then we will return to what those uncomfortable connotations are and where they come from shortly. So I will argue that there are three normal types of frontiers that human populations can find. The first type of frontier is the most obvious. A geographic frontier exists when individuals from a population discover some new landmass that is unexploited and they figure out how to use it. So probably the greatest frontier in all of human history is the one that Paleo-Indians discovered when, at the end of the last ice age, they moved from a now submerged landmass that scientists call Beringia into North America and then later into South America. This tiny population of what we think was a few thousand people living in the Bering Strait on a cold grassland during the last ice age discovered 2 entire continents without any human competition in them. That is the most glorious discovery a tiny group of people could ever make, because they were, in the aftermath of that, able to produce, well, the number is controversial, but probably somewhere between 50 to 100 million people. So in terms of how human beings do, on average, in a population that's not growing, people replace themselves. They will have 2 offspring, each of which is 50% related to them. But if you were lucky enough to be a dweller of Beringia at the point that Beringians found their way into North America, that tiny little population of a couple thousand became a population of tens of millions over the course of 15,000 years, which is a truly wonderful result. The second kind of frontier will not immediately make sense with that term, but it has exactly the same effect. A technological frontier is when you discover a mechanism for making more of the available land that you have through some sort of technological innovation. So here we have a picture of some Incan terracing. Inca were famous for intensive agriculture in circumstances where it was very difficult to grow things. The steep, rocky sides of the Andes are not especially hospitable to agriculture, and they figured out how to do it. And so you can imagine in your mind how many people could the hills of the slopes of the Andes support if you didn't have agricultural terracing, and then how many people could those same slopes support once you innovate this mechanism for capturing soil and then enriching it. And so the answer is the same landmass produced a much larger population once terracing was discovered. And really every agricultural technology qualifies as a frontier. Once these things are discovered, very frequently they spread to other populations, because you can simply witness how it is that other people are competing for resources, and in most cases, one can, often through trial and error, reinvent the same sorts of discoveries that they happened upon. All right, now things get unpleasant. The third kind of frontier is what I call a transfer frontier. And transfer frontiers occur when there hasn't been a discovery of a new landmass and there hasn't been a discovery of a new technology. But what there has been is an outbreak of tribalism, where people recognize that another population is not capable of defending the resources that it owns. And if an excuse can be generated to pursue those people's resources, that can, from the point of view of the population engaging in this act of transfer, function in exactly the same way. It generates a burst of growth and abundance that is, as I said before, the way that winning in evolutionary terms feels. So many of the worst atrocities in history match this pattern. Obviously, the Holocaust was a prime example of this, where a small population in Europe was unable to defend the resources that it had against a population that was well armed and well organized to take them. And so from the point of view of understanding the Holocaust, it makes sense really to turn down the volume on what was being said and simply look at the populations as a biologist would look at them, and then it makes a great deal of sense. It's a horrifying kind of sense, but nonetheless, it is comprehensible. It was a monstrous act, but it was interpretable as rational. What I've started to say is that the boom and bust cycles that arise because creatures seek growth, and human beings seek growth in particular ways, but that growth is never sustained because we always create more people or more consumption to use up the burst of growth that we have found, results in tyranny being the end game of prosperity. Now this, I believe, is where we are in history. Tyranny is beginning to break out because we have run up against the end of growth, and it is something that we should think very carefully about. The question is there some alternative whereby we might end these boom and bust cycles in the same way that economists seek to end boom and bust cycles in the market? So here's another excellent example of a transfer frontier. So the Americas were discovered, as I mentioned before, by Beringians at the end of the last ice age who came into North America and then South America. And then, of course, the New World was discovered again by the Spaniards. And the Spaniards found themselves a frontier. Why was it a frontier if it was full of 50 to 100 million people? It was a frontier because of Guns, Germs, and Steel. If you haven't read Guns, Germs, and Steel, I recommend it. This had nothing to do with endogenous characteristics of the Spaniards. It had to do with technologically where they were as a result of accidents of history and geography. But nonetheless, it meant that they had a very easy time overrunning indigenous populations. In some ways, they did it without even realizing, by spreading things like smallpox to populations that could not immunologically defend themselves. All right, so let's talk for a moment about the Fermi paradox, which some of you are probably aware of. The Fermi paradox, named after Enrico Fermi, is the idea that there is a conflict between the observation that our galaxy and the universe are extremely large. When Fermi formulated this, he didn't know how large. We now know that the light from 300 sextillion stars actually reaches the Earth. So the visible universe is 300 sextillion stars. And if you ever want to entertain yourself, look that number up and start comparing it to other very large numbers, and you'll see just how immense the universe actually is. The problem is, the universe is very large, and as we study the question of how life first emerges, we keep realizing that actually the chemistry that underlies the beginning of life isn't all that complicated. So it stands to reason there ought to be a great many civilizations out there that have reached technological sophistication, and yet when we point our radio telescopes to the sky, it's very quiet. I mean, we have yet to detect a single one. And so the question is, why is the universe so quiet? If evolution happens, there are lots of habitable planets in the universe, and eventually creatures will happen on technological solutions that would make them audible to us. And the best answer to this question is that if you discover technology sufficiently powerful that you can broadcast things into the sky, you will discover a great many other technologies right along with it. And those technologies are self-destructive. So the question is, how long does a technologically sophisticated civilization continue to exist after it has discovered these technologies with which it can kill itself off? Maybe the answer to the Fermi paradox is that nobody gets through that barrier. Now, I very much hope that's not the case, and I can't think of a single reason, scientifically speaking, why it must be the case. But I do think there is probably a lot of truth in the idea that the universe is very quiet because most civilizations do not make it. So what I want to suggest to you, and this is actually a little bit in conflict with my history. Many years ago, I was part of the Occupy movement, which I think the major success of the Occupy movement was that it correctly lodged the idea of the 99% in the public consciousness. And if your civilization is rigged against 99% of the population, it probably isn't a democracy. That was an important idea. So I resonate with the 99%, but when it comes to the Fermi paradox, I would like to imagine that actually a small number of civilizations probably do get through because they begin to have the conversation about the danger they pose to themselves early enough that they can think their way around it. So I don't know what the number would be. Hopefully it's as large as 1%. But in any case, we ought to become elitists in this regard and attempt to join the intergalactic 1% that make it through the Fermi paradox without destroying themselves. And that's really what this talk is about, is how might we rethink the problems that we face so that we don't end up bringing civilization and humanity to an end. The first problem we face with respect to getting into the intergalactic 1% is novelty. Now, evolution seems to prepare creatures for the environments in which they live. Actually, that's a bit of an optical illusion, though. Really what evolution does is it prepares you for the environments that your ancestors lived in. And because the environments that your ancestors lived in very strongly tend to resemble the environment that you live in, it seems as if you're prepared for the environment that you live in. The problem is, any time the environment that you live in doesn't look like your ancestors' environment, evolution has not prepared you for it. Now, human beings do have a mechanism for addressing that mismatch, but the problem is our new environment isn't even a sitting target. Our new environment is so rapidly changing that evolution simply cannot keep up with the new challenges that we keep introducing to ourselves. So, novelty is a problem evolutionarily speaking, as it must be, and we have a special version of that problem because our rate of change is so high. Now, evolutionists also have a concept we call the EEA, the Environment of Evolutionary Adaptedness. And unfortunately, this excellent concept is not instantiated well in science. So you've probably all heard a lot of discussion about paleo diets and things, basically the idea that human beings spent something like 6 million years the 6 million years since our branching point from chimpanzees were spent in some form of hunting and gathering or other. And so we tend to imagine that we are Pleistocene hunter-gatherers stuck in the modern world, and that much of our ill health and failure to be at ease is a result of that mismatch, and so we should try to restore the Pleistocene environment. This is an error. Many of the things about us did come about in the Pleistocene. Many other things about us, including most of our psychological tendencies, have been at least heavily modified under more modern circumstances since the birth of farming 10,000 years ago, for example. So the way to think about it is that the environment of evolutionary adaptedness is a good concept, but it doesn't apply to a creature. Human beings don't have an evolutionary environment of Pleistocene hunting and gathering. Each trait that we have, each characteristic has an environment in which it initially made sense, and some of those traits then go on to stop making sense. So anyway, think of it on a per trait basis. Here's a good example of a novelty effect that potentially has very serious consequences. This is the person who has fallen asleep at the wheel of the car. Now, you will notice that you don't fall asleep walking around very often, but I bet you if I asked the audience how many people here have fallen asleep behind the wheel of a car, at least for a moment or two, most of you would say yes if you drive. The reason for that is that there are no cars in your ancestral environment, and so the body does not correctly register that you're hurtling down the road at 60 miles an hour, because really what you're doing is sitting in a chair, not experiencing the acceleration that goes along with starting up from a dead stop or going around a corner, and that can lull you to sleep. This is a result of you just not being prepared for cars and having to take special action, whether it's drinking coffee or pulling over or something like that. So bottlenecks are what happens when a population does not have the capacity to address the challenges that it faces. And bottlenecks are not necessarily something that you get through, but every population should hope to get through whatever bottlenecks it faces. Now, there's been much discussion of the fact that people are always saying that the world is ending, and you may hear me saying, Fermi paradox, the world is ending, and people are always wrong about that. They have to have always been wrong, right? But here's the question, why do people always say that? I think there's a strong possibility people say that because bottlenecks have been very common, and the world has ended again and again and again. And what it does is it ends for populations, and those populations that correctly understand when they are approaching a bottleneck and figure out how to address the issue go on to leave future populations, and those populations that don't figure it out or don't take the bottleneck seriously enough perish. And so If you think about the mythology that human beings pass along to each other as population-level mythology rather than humanity-level mythology, then you have to take the concept that the world is ending much more seriously than you would otherwise. The problem for us, though, is that our systems, the systems that keep us alive, are so interconnected and so novel that it is likely that if we screw up, that the entirety of humanity is going to blink out this time, for the first time. That really hasn't been an issue until very recently in history, but the interconnectedness of all of our systems makes it an issue in the present. So here's a fine example of unanticipated consequences. That's a picture of the Fukushima Daiichi reactor after the triple meltdown in March of 2011. So here we had a reactor, or a set of reactors, that was humming along, doing its job. Actually, an entirely foreseeable set of events unfolded with an earthquake followed by a tsunami that swamped some generators that were necessary to keep the cooling flowing through the reactors, and the excess heat buildup caused 3 reactors to melt down in quick succession. These kinds of systems, this is the sort of thing, this is not probably an extinction level event for humanity, although there's still an awful lot of material there that is not under control, but you can't go through very many of these things before you start compromising oceans and land masses at too high a rate to address it. Existential risks are risks to humanity. We either have a proliferation of existential risks that is difficult to explain, or we have a small number of errors in the way civilization is constructed that are resulting in a large number of symptoms, many of which can be characterized as existential threats to humanity. I think it is much more productive and much more insightful if we look at a small number of errors inside of our civilization structure and think about how they may be generating a large number of types of jeopardy. So one of the things that causes one of the assumptions that we get wrong has to do with evolving systems. Very frequently people will build something, and it may be something marvelous and it may solve some sort of a problem, but they do not realize that as they are introducing it to the world, that they are actually setting up the conditions for evolution to occur, which are not very many. When you set one of these things in motion, and it's an evolutionary system, then it begins to pursue objectives that you do not detect because they were not intended when the system was set up. So we currently have many people, for example, in Silicon Valley, who are at the forefront of the social network revolution, who are now having to rig their own lives around keeping social networks they helped to construct away from them during certain times of day, certain months of year, because they're too addictive to be healthy. The people who helped construct these things are having to rig their lives around staying away from them because they can't just trust themselves to self-regulate. That's because the system has evolved to be very addictive, right? So evolving systems are a hazard. Another hazard has to do with novel complexity. That when you think of the huge number of, let's say, chemical influences that you encounter every day, chemical influences that no ancestor of yours could possibly have encountered because the laboratories that produced them didn't exist, it's very difficult to detect if one of these things is harming you because there's so much noise generated by the large number of things with which you're interacting. So those two things in combination are very dangerous to us, and we need to think about how to begin to back away from the precipice that is caused by our tendency to be enthusiastic about systems that end up evolving and systems that create extra complexity for us. Here is, this is a solar storm depicted here. Solar storms are something that happens with great intensity. Prior to having an electric grid, they were not a threat to humanity. But the way our current electric grid is rigged, they are capable of destroying the transformers that result in energy coming out of the wall, which seems like it would be really inconvenient. The problem is these transformers are very difficult to construct, and so it is completely conceivable that a strong solar storm of a kind that people have seen in historical times, like the Carrington event, that these solar storms could take out the grid for some large portion of, let's say, North America, and that it could be unrestorable for 6 months or longer. That is especially difficult to deal with if there are nuclear reactors depending on energy to remain cool within that area. So the point I'm trying to make is that solar storms, which would have been a very minor influence for ancestors a few hundred years ago, are now potentially a catastrophic influence because we've built something marvelous, the electric grid, which allows us to go about our lives and do wonderful things without having to worry too much about where the energy is coming from. But we've created a major hazard that continues without our addressing it, because until we've experienced a catastrophic failure, it's not obvious to us that we're in jeopardy. Okay, now we're going to get to where the rubber meets the road from the point of view of what we are all supposed to do. We need to start rethinking the discussions that we are having surrounding politics and the future. The discussions we are having are clearly dysfunctional. Anybody can detect that. And we have to find our way out, which is very difficult because if somebody tells you you need to stop thinking that way, you begin to feel defensive about the things that you know are true and that we just need to accomplish. The first way to get to a new conversation is to dichotomize between values and policy. Values are the things that you want to happen. They are the characteristics that you want your system to have. Policy are the mechanisms whereby you might get there. Now, this is where I'm going to argue that the dichotomy between right and left has come completely off the rails, and that to the extent we are still stuck in right-left arguments, it is an error, and it is forcing us to have discussions that will never be able to solve the problems that we face. Now, I don't know how many of you have taken the political compass test. I recommend that you take the political compass test if you haven't taken it already. Now, I'm not going to endorse the test itself. The test itself is a bit noisy in terms of where it places you on this four-quadrant grid. But what I do want you to take away from this is the idea that these four quadrants are actually real. Now, the upper two quadrants are the authoritarian quadrants. So on the y-axis, we have authoritarianism on top and libertarianism on the bottom. Libertarianism is not economic libertarianism, I should point out. In the bottom two quadrants, you have left libertarianism and right libertarianism. Now, what I am discovering ever more as I've been tossed into a world of people discussing our current political dysfunction is that there is tremendous room for agreement amongst people who find themselves in the bottom two quadrants. There is almost no reason to disagree. Amongst those who prioritize liberty, there is very little reason to disagree because essentially a progressive and an economic libertarian, so a progressive being a left libertarian and an economic libertarian being a right-leaning libertarian, share a belief that a fair system is desirable. What they disagree about is the wisdom of tinkering with the system in order to get to increased fairness. Now, I submit to you, we don't actually know enough to tinker with our system with the present toolkit. In other words, if we were to employ the systems that are advocated by those on the left or the systems that are advocated by those on the right, we would find that they both failed to deliver the values that we, all of those of us on the bottom two quadrants here, would agree are desirable. What I will argue is that it is time for people in those bottom two quadrants, left libertarians and right libertarians, to unify against the authoritarians and to find new solutions which will exist on the z-axis. That is to say, not on that original diagram. These things don't yet have a name. We have to figure out what they are, and we will be much more likely to figure out what they are if we team up between those bottom two quadrants. The other thing that is true is that there's an advantage strategically to those bottom two libertarian quadrants teaming up together that comes from the fact that the upper two quadrants can't stand each other. So they have a built-in disadvantage in the sense that left authoritarians and right-leaning authoritarians are actually after two different worlds. So strategically and logically, it makes sense to seek new solutions on the z-axis and to put aside archaic discussions of right and left that are incapable of solving the problems we face in any case. Okay, now a word about utopianism. I'm going to say some things about the world that we ought to create if I'm right about where we are and what might be possible, and they may sound utopian to you. I assure you they are not. I find utopianism is probably the worst idea human beings have ever come up with. And if you don't believe that utopianism is a terrible idea, then study the latter half of the 20th century carefully, because really a tremendous amount of carnage resulted from utopianism. Utopians do two things wrong, and this will help you understand what I mean by that term. First thing utopians do wrong is they optimize for a single objective. Now, this is going to sound probably incorrect to you, but I'm speaking now scientifically. If you optimize any mechanism for a single objective, you will create catastrophes for every other value. It doesn't matter how glorious the objective you have in mind is. If you optimize for justice, for example, then you will create a catastrophe for liberty, right? You will create a catastrophe for your ability to feed populations. You may feed populations equally poorly across the board, but you won't feed them well. So you have to grow past the idea that there's some objective worth pursuing at any cost, because if you pursue an objective at any cost, you will create a disaster for every other value. Now this results because of a concept that if there's one concept, if I had to teach one concept to people that does more heavy lifting than any others, it's this concept, which we've borrowed from economics. We tend to hear diminishing returns and think that it's an economic concept. It's not inherently an economic concept. Diminishing returns applies any place that a complex system intersects with an objective. If you have a complex system and there's an identifiable objective, diminishing returns will characterize the way that system functions. And so the reason that utopia is such a terrible idea is if you optimize for a single characteristic, you will run into severe diminishing returns and create catastrophes for all of the other things you might pursue. The other thing that utopians do wrong is they have a foolish kind of optimism about how much they know about the world that they are pursuing. They will think that they know how to construct it based on the things they understand, and they will tend to discount those things that they do not yet understand. So here is an example of a non-utopian. This is somebody who's created a cell phone using a Raspberry Pi. It's not a cell phone you would want. It's pretty cruddy, right? But it's a great prototype. You build one of those, then you know what you need to do the next time in order to make it better, and sooner or later you end up with something like that that's actually highly functional. So the ability to prototype a system rather than imagine that you know directly how to go to the solution is the key to building a civilization that functions. The civilization that I think we ought to build, again, I'm not telling you I know how to construct it, but I do think I know where the first prototypes would be. The situation that we want to construct is a society that has what I would call engineered stable abundance. So remember that tyranny sets in because populations find a non-zero sum circumstance, they capture all the resources, and then austerity sets in and people go after each other with tribalism. The alternative involves finding a mechanism to stabilize the sensation of abundance, to provide for people in a way that they actually feel they are living in an abundant, safe world that is protecting them. And it can't be a lie. It has to function well so that their needs really are taken care of. If you did that, then the program that human beings carry with them that allows them, yes, to compete, but to do so in ways that are not objectionable, those characteristics would come out. And we would see the opposite of what we're seeing presently, which is the onset of intense tribalism that will result in catastrophe. So here you have a picture of a hummingbird, and I use this as my sort of icon for a non-utopian, stably abundant system. The thing about a hummingbird is they're marvelous. I don't know how much time you all have spent looking at them. Every time I encounter a hummingbird, I feel that I have gotten as close to a miracle as anybody ever does, right? It's a marvelous creature, but it's non-utopian. This creature came about without a designer, and it functions on the basis of feedbacks, right? It does not function the way our system is constructed to function, where there's an oscillation between left and right. The left gets in power, it gets overly enthusiastic about solution making, and it goes too far. That causes a backlash. The right takes over the system and becomes overly stingy and takes apart the solution making. That's a very crude mechanism for managing civilization. A hummingbird functions on the basis of automatic feedbacks that detect perturbations in different parameters and adjust characteristics so that the animal can go and do what it needs to do. if we're to build a civilization that functions, it will be based on feedbacks that allow it to self-navigate and self-correct without us having to have political arguments. Having agreed upon what the objective is, that objective can be deployed in a way that is very tightly controlled, but in a way that is not onerous to people. In other words, that society ought to be liberating. Just the same way the hummingbird is liberated to think about hummingbird concerns rather than thinking about regulating its temperature, people should be liberated to think about producing marvelous things rather than have to fend off their economic competitors for fear of losing their health care. Okay, now, the most important piece of hope that I find in looking at this landscape is that it would appear that certain of our predecessors may have figured this out already. Now, I'm not saying that they consciously figured it out or that they would recognize the description that I'm presenting, but I've become fascinated with many of the New World civilizations that have existed, in particular the Maya. Now, the Maya are often mischaracterized because the Mayan Empire came apart before the Spaniards arrived. And so there is this connotation to the Maya that there was something that they were doing wrong. But the fact is they had existed for thousands of years doing the impossible before their civilization came apart. So we don't exactly know how they were doing it. But in places like Copan, a dynasty lasted 1,000 years, farming on fragile tropical alluvial soils with intensive agriculture. That's an amazing feat. The Maya, in fact, had a unit of time, the Baktun, which was 400 years long. This was such a far-sighted civilization that they actually needed longer timescales that they could describe than we typically use. So, at the same time, the Maya were prone to building these massive monuments that are so famous that don't appear to have any material purpose. They have a spiritual purpose, but they don't have a material purpose, and that's curious. Why would a civilization that is so far-sighted engage in a kind of waste, like constructing these temples? Well, I won't go deeply into the idea here, but I will submit to you that the Maya may have found a mechanism for not turning new resources into more Mayans or more consumption. By investing in these large temple structures, effectively giant public works projects, they enhanced the lives of the Mayan populace without creating so many Mayans in a good year that every bad year resulted in a lot of tribalism as a result of the fact that there was not enough food to go around. In a bad year, you don't invest in the temples. In a good year, you invest. And these temples, in fact, what you can't tell from the outside is that they were growing. These temples were layered on top of temples, and they would continue to grow ever larger, and in fact the largest temples are, in a sense, a testament to how far-sighted the populations that built them must have been. All right, so what I have argued effectively is that there are three kinds of frontiers, and that we should be afraid that our built-in evolutionary systems have directed us to the third, most unfortunate kind of frontier, which is a sort of tyranny in which people steal from each other in order to restore a sense of growth. What I've argued here is that there is in fact a fourth, hidden kind of frontier that involves us engineering a stable kind of abundance that will bring out the best in human beings. Thanks very much.